And so we thank our next speaker for being very flexible with us. I'm not going to go into the long introduction. I think many of you know the Reverend Fletcher Harper, Executive Director of Green Faith, a visionary, an inspiration, an author, and a very powerful speaker on this, our collective work. He is also the point person for the faith contingent for tomorrow's People's Climate March, and so he will be scooting out right after he speaks. Fletcher, we appreciate your being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Martha Lyle. It's great to be here and great to see a lot of friends. Pat, where did Pat was over there. I'm not sure where Pat Watkins went. Maybe he's still out getting coffee somewhere. And John Hill I saw somewhere. I'm not doing well here at locating people. And Jenny Phillips, but at any rate, and many other. Yep, Jenny I know where. Jenny stayed in the same place. You know, it used to be when people sat in a place in church, they stayed in the same place. But John and Pat clearly haven't gotten the memo on that one. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and I'm from New York, so I'm going to talk fast. And then we're going to have some time for a little bit of back and forth because you guys have been doing a lot of listening and absorbing. So the basic thing that I want to do is to share some stories because, as our preacher reminded us, we're in a dark time on a lot of levels right now. There is rightly a lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of sadness, frankly still a lot of disbelief about what we're having to deal with given all of the work and all of the very real progress that we've made over the past decade. And so what I want to do is to start with a couple of stories or a little bit of a narrative because there was another time not so far long ago that we were in a similar kind of situation. And I think sometimes telling the story of that can help us sort of find our mojo again in a way that's really important. So many of you will remember that in 2009, the hopes of the world in terms of climate change were pinned on Copenhagen, on the international negotiations in Copenhagen. It was very clear to everybody that the scientific evidence was sort of clear beyond a doubt that if we didn't get an agreement in Copenhagen that was a strong one, internationally binding, that we were simply out of time and that we were dealing with irreversible impacts that were going to displace hundreds of millions of people. You know the litany of horrors. And you also know what happened in Copenhagen, which was there was this massive lead up and build up within the climate movement. We got to Copenhagen and it was an utter failure. Nothing happened. The bottom fell out. There was an inability to reach an agreement. And at that point, the climate movement internationally went into about a 2-year period of depression because if Copenhagen wasn't bad enough, pretty soon after Copenhagen, you know who took over the House of Representatives. And we had the Tea Party to deal with, and it became even more clear that we weren't going to get any kind of international or national leadership on climate change through the legislative process. John Dominic Crossan, the Catholic scholar, wrote a great short book that I don't think people read anymore called The Dark Interval. It was about the crucifixion and resurrection. And he talked about the fact that everybody, whether it's an individual, a family, a household, an organization, a congregation, a country, whatever, that there come times in all of our lives when the narrative that we've been living by disintegrates. And when that happens, you enter into a dark interval because you realize how much your life is constructed by the stories that you tell yourself about how things are going to work. The story that we had been telling ourselves was a very rational one about climate change. It was that good scientific information was going to lead to greater levels of awareness on a grassroots level, that greater levels of awareness would translate into pressure on political leaders, elected officials, that those elected officials would act rationally and would pass legislation that would solve the problem. That would lead up to an international agreement, and that would be the way the problem would be solved. A rational story, it's a nice story, nice enough as stories go, but it didn't work. And so here's this dark interval, and the wonderful and the important thing about dark intervals is that you never know where the first crack is going to open up so that some light can come back in. So in late 2011, the first crack opened up in Pennsylvania at Swarthmore College because a number of college students who were utterly disgusted with the inability of their elders to get with the program went to their administration of the university. And they said that they thought that if it was the mission of the university to prepare for them for the future, that the university had absolutely no business investing in the fossil fuel industry, which was destroying that future. The university's administration reacted with an almost endearing level of condescension, and they told the students that this was fine and nice, but they should go back to their studies and do their homework and let the adults take care of running the shop. The students went back. I assume they continued to do their homework. They also got a hold of the home addresses of a number of the trustees of the university and started writing them very thoughtful letters about why it was incomprehensible to them that the university would continue to invest in fossil fuels. They didn't get anywhere. The wonderful thing about this story is that Swarthmore to this day is still invested in fossil fuels, but what happened was that Bill McKibben, who you all will hear from later on, heard about this story, wrote about it in his article in Rolling Stone magazine, The Terrifying New Math of Global Warming. The article went viral. Within 6 months, there were 300 fossil fuel divestment movements on college campuses around the country and beyond. The movement spread rapidly. Faith communities got massively involved. The first faith-based institution to divest, which got almost no press at all, was that hotbed of radicalism, the Church of Sweden, which not only divested from fossil fuels, but committed to invest in climate solutions. They were followed by the United Church of Christ, the Unitarian Universalist Association, Union Theological Seminary, the World Council of Churches, numerous denominations in Australia. It takes guts for faith communities to divest in Australia, where over 30% of the economy is run by the extractive industry. We think we've got issues here in this country. Think about being a pastor or a faith leader, a bishop in Australia, and having the guts to take a divestment stand. I like that kind of church. The momentum built. The leadership of Divest, Fossil-Free UMC, is going to be speaking to you all in a couple minutes and did an unreal job of rattling the cage of this important denomination in terms of raising that argument and making it morally unavoidable. And I'm not going to steal her thunder by letting her, by telling too many of the stories that I hope she'll share, but this denomination and the entire movement owes Jenny Phillips and her team a big debt of gratitude for the work that they did. And what we started seeing was all of a sudden this wonderful veneer of rationality around how this problem was going to get solved began to give way, and all sorts of interesting things started to happen. I'm Episcopalian, so I can share this story. A small group of us got together to push the Episcopal Church to divest. The former presiding bishop was a wonderful person, oceanographer by training before she got ordained, big proponent of action on climate change for reasons that we didn't quite understand, but this is what happens with these kinds of things. Came out publicly against divestment. And then the executive committee of the church wrote a supposedly secret memo that got leaked also opposing divestment. And the general convention of the church happened within a couple of months, and divestment passed by an overwhelming margin. And so what it showed was that there was, believe it or not, something bigger than religious institutions involved in terms of guiding this process. We like to talk a lot about the inbreaking of the Spirit, but my experience is that when the Spirit really does break in, institutions usually dig in their heels, and it's a wonderful thing to see when that process actually gets engaged, and that's exactly what's happened. It wasn't just divestment that started moving things forward. The People's Climate March in 2014 in New York shattered everybody's expectations in terms of what was possible. We were on the organizing team for that. The night before the march, we were hoping and praying that we would get 100,000 people in the streets. And so when 400,000 plus showed up peacefully and marched, it was truly amazing. We, in the faith community, had 30 different denominations and religious traditions represented. We had a sign for each of them. Another signal that something interesting was happening was that 2 weeks before the march, I got a phone call from one of the biggest atheist groups in the country who was angry because we didn't have an atheist contingent marching with the multi-faith community. Who would have known, right? So we made an atheist sign. Then a couple of atheists gave us money, and they became upset because on the drop-down menu, which we thought had every religious and spiritual tradition known to humankind on it, didn't have atheist. So we put atheist into the list. Atheist begins with A. And so now when people do our religious donor drop-down menu, the first option they see is atheist. I haven't done a study to figure out how many donations that's cost us yet, but the reality of the situation, I think, is that what this signifies is that all of a sudden the words that we use to describe the mystery that our preacher referred to are on some level inadequate. And, not that that should be a surprise to us, but there is this wonderful yearning and searching for something that is real, and that language and that yearning absolutely and deeply embraces the creation. The climate march came and went. Pope Francis came out and did us all a big solid with the encyclical that he threw down. Absolutely amazing religious document. We were able to organize a multi-faith march into St. Peter's Square 10 days after the encyclical came out to thank the Pope, to bring thanks from the religious traditions of the world. And it was an incredible moment. One of the guys who'd done the arts work for the climate march in New York, we recruited him to work with us. And he had these wonderful doves that they're sort of 5-6 feet wide. You'd put them on a 30-foot bamboo pole and swing them around. They're absolutely spectacular. This guy, I don't think, had been to church ever. The guy who made, he works for the Muppets company, the Henson company. He's a wonderful guy, artist. I don't think he's got a sort of organized religious bone anywhere close to his body. But he loved the Pope, and he had made 9 of these birds for New York. He loved the Pope so much that he made 30 for Rome. So we marched towards St. Peter's Square, and the Vatican security had told us all the way along that we weren't going to be able to go into St. Peter's Square with our stuff because it's dangerous, and we get that. So we were sort of all tactically planned to fan out around that. We were going to surround St. Peter's Square with the doves. We get 100 yards from the entrance to St. Peter's Square, and the Swiss Guard dude comes out in his great uniform and says, come on in, because clearly word had come down from upstairs that we were welcome. So we come in, the Pope comes out and does his normal weekly Angelus blessing, the formal part, and then he thanks people of different faiths and different spiritualities for working together to care for our common home. We had a gathering of about 150 Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Baha'is, Christians, indigenous peoples. The Hare Krishnas, if you're ever going marching anywhere, march with the Hare Krishnas because they dance the whole way. So it's a great way to pass the time. So the Hare Krishnas dance into St. Peter's Square. The Pope comes out and says this stuff. I was standing next to a young Jewish guy, and he turns to me, he says, I'm a Jew from Brooklyn. And I just came into St. Peter's Square with my new friends, the Hare Krishnas, and the Pope came out and thanked us. And so time went on, and these mobilizations and these uprisings that many of us, all of us, have been part of were the reason that we got the Paris Agreement. If I've learned anything over the last decade in this work, it's that politicians absolutely do not lead. They absolutely do not lead. They follow. And so if we want politicians to do anything, then we have to get active, and we have to show them that it's safe for them to do so, because they will not lead without that. I guess I sound critical with that, and I guess I am to some degree, but it's a reality. And the quicker we accept that, the better off we'll be. And that's why it's so important that we're going to be marching tomorrow in, God save us, 92-degree heat. Whenever that happens, I wonder who the person was that invented these wonderful things that So here we are now in another kind of dark interval with an administration whose policies towards God's creation, let alone the rest of the shooting match, are charitably described as sinful. One of the most compelling statements I saw coming out in the wake of the election was a statement from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which actually referred to the policies of the new administration, including the climate policies, as demonic. Was interesting. Well, more about that another time. And so my sense is that in this time, when obviously we're playing defense on the national level, what it underscores is I think, two or three things. The first is that more than ever before, the time to commit locally is now. All around the country, people, groups are resisting pipeline development, new fossil fuel infrastructure. They're finding ways to support green job training programs that will put people back to work while retrofitting literally every building in the country, which needs to be retrofitted. Those are jobs that cannot be outsourced. They are good, skilled trade jobs. They represent an opportunity to help rebuild a middle class in a way that we've all seen as critically important, not that we haven't known it for a long time. Local organizing and action matters now more than it ever has, and it will be where the real victories will be won. And every once in a while, we'll need to come together and celebrate like we're doing tomorrow, but let's not kid ourselves that the real work and the real accomplishment is what we're going to be able to deliver on the municipal and county and state level. That really matters. The second piece is that I would like to suggest that this movement, the religious environmental movement, in which many of us, all of us, are deeply involved, needs to make a very intentional commitment to become more interfaith. You wouldn't be surprised hearing that from me, and more interracial. Right now, we're too white. There are reasons for that. Good, bad, and indifferent. But the reality is that the future of this movement, as I see every day in the work that we do with the People's Climate Movement, is with multiracial coalitions that include workers, that include healthcare professionals, that include frontline communities, that really understand the wonderful phrase from 2014, to change everything, you need everyone. And if we don't work in the church to understand and to make real on this sense that, that the communities that suffer the worst while contributing next to nothing to the climate crisis are communities of color and low-income communities. And if we don't reckon with that, then we will, that's part of, to use a good Methodist term, that's part of the sanctification walk that we need to take with this. We need to reckon with that. We need to sit, those of us who are white, uncomfortably with that, and we need to grow, not only in terms of our commitment around the environment, but also our commitment around racial justice. I thought one of the most powerful things in the last several years was, I'm from the New York area, when Eric Garner was killed by the police for selling a pack of cigarettes on the side of the street. And the police put him in a chokehold, and he was saying, "I can't breathe." And he had asthma, and he had asthma in part because he lived in a heavily air-polluted community and had for his entire life. 50,000 people every year die in the U.S. prematurely from air pollution. Those deaths are concentrated in communities of color and low-income communities. You go internationally, the figures are even worse. The whole coal-producing region of China, which has over 250 million people living in it. Life expectancy is at least 5 years lower solely because of the pollution from the coal-burning plants. That is a loss of life that, if you total up the years, is just sickening. So we need to understand, and we need to sort of commit around the social and racial justice aspects of this. And then the final thing is that we need to be bold. I'd like to suggest that the time has come when people like those of us in this room need to make it clear that it's no longer morally acceptable for faith communities to be using fossil fuels to power their operations. We can no longer worship God while purchasing fossil fuels. I just don't think that's morally justifiable anymore. And what that means in many ways, because most of us can't get solar panels, it's not, the market hasn't evolved to that point quite yet, is that we need to do the efficiency stuff really aggressively, and we need to buy carbon offsets. And we need to find ways to source those offsets that will support the development of renewable energy in energy-poor regions of the world, so that people, the 1.1 billion people around the planet who lack access to electricity, can get that access and can get access to clean energy. It's fascinating to watch the fossil fuel industry try to take a moral high ground in a lot of their communication, and to say that that it is their moral mission to bring energy to people who lack energy. Because that's the line that they're using very, very consistently. There's a new campaign that we're part of called SHINE, which is about ending energy poverty with clean energy, renewable energy, by the year 2030. It's an achievable goal, and we're going to be knocking on the doors of different religious investment houses to see if they'll be willing to make some investments in this, because the time has come where that's both possible and necessary. So I'm gonna stop there. I think we've got sort of 10 minutes to go. I think, you know what I'm gonna finish up on is, so you gotta do a little bit of practice, because assuming that you all are marching tomorrow, so the big culminating action of the day will start in front of the Capitol. There's gonna be some wonderful singing that we'll be doing, multi-faith songs offered by different friends, and it's been wonderful to work with our colleagues at the DC Area Interfaith Power and Light Affiliate to get all of this organized. And we'll walk down Pennsylvania Avenue at 2 o'clock. We should be around the White House, and the plan is that we're going to surround the White House entirely, and then we're going to sit down. And we're going to lock arms like people do when they're doing a civil disobedience action. We're not doing a civil disobedience action, but we're going to sort of make that symbol, because we think that's the right one and the meaningful one to make. And there's going to be a couple of minutes of silence. So the Buddhists in the multi-faith contingent like the silence, right? They're down with the silence. At the end of 2 minutes, what we're going to start to do is what we're calling the heartbeat. And what we're going to do for 100 seconds is where everybody, and we're going to try to get this synchronized, is going to mimic the sound of a heartbeat. So we're going to. So what I want is, let's do this together, because it actually sounds pretty cool when you do it. So. "100 seconds of that. And then at that point, we're going to stand, and we're going to rise, and we're going to start to shout. And we haven't quite yet figured out what we're going to shout yet, but it's going to be great. They're all, but I think my guess is that we'll figure something out. The Buddhists don't like the shouting quite as much as they like the silence, but that's okay. They're still with us. That's actually. And that's going to be that's going to be the experience, because a big part of, people always say, oh, these big mobilizations, they accomplished anything? Hell yeah. What they do is they give those of us who participate in them, I mean, it's essentially, in my view, a collective public ritual that we're going through together, through which we are transformed, through which the grace of God's overwhelming abundance breaks right in. And we gain a sense of meaning and community and get energized in ways that we need to be. So that's the prep. You guys are ready for tomorrow. It'll be great to see you out there. Get there, wear a hat, wear loose clothing. There are going to be watering stations along the way. But it'll be great to be in the streets together. Well, why don't we take a couple of, Martha Lyle, we have a couple of minutes left for questions and comments and agreements, disagreements. Yep. And why don't you introduce yourself so folks know who you are.
Hi, I'm Jane Ward. I'm from Metropolitan Memorial in our Methodist Church in the district. And I just want to say, hold on to your hats in terms of solar being affordable. The churches and nonprofits in the district right now are being approached by investors and being offered an opportunity to be paid for hosting a solar system on their property. Essentially, the city council has required the utilities in the district to, over the next several years, buy at least 5% of their energy that they sell from solar generated in the district. And because of that, the solar renewable energy certificates and the tax credit are so good that groups of investors are coming together, working with solar companies, and they're offering our church a net either savings and or sharing of a bonus of about $90,000 to host a small solar system with 100 panels. After 6 years, the system's depreciated, leading to our church. This is taking off, and Bloomberg and his partner Carl Pope co-authored a recent book that's just out this week. I think Climate Hope, some of you may have heard, that they're starting to figure out that once you put renewable energy in place, you don't have to pay for the sun and the wind. So once you pay for the installation, down the road, not only do you have the free energy, but you have health savings and so much else. So I just wanted to bring that update so that people don't think it's expensive to install solar. If you're a church or other nonprofit right now, look for a group of investors, talk to the solar companies. It's unbelievable.
I want to echo that. I'm Michael Black. I'm from Decatur, which is part of Metro Atlanta. I'm at North Decatur, Decatur First, United Methodist Church. And we have a solarized program that we started in Decatur and DeKalb County, which everybody collectively joins in on so that it reduces the amount that it is because you're buying a large amount of the solar as a community. And the Atlanta City Council this Monday is voting to go 100% clean electricity for the whole city of Atlanta. The City Council will vote on that. We're pushing hard that will pass by 2035.
I'm Michael Snowhart. I am Beth Bond. A lot of y'all know me. I do Caretakers and creation care work. And I am now doing a solarized program in Greenville, South Carolina. And through that, I found out that PCUSA has a solar fund for 2.5%. So hashtag jealous, giving this United Methodist. But if you have friends that are Presbyterians, the Presbyterians are not doing a good job, so they have challenges with communications that we United Methodist have. And so I want y'all to go back and find Presbyterian friends and make them an example. They put 10% down, they get solar at 2.5%, and they start ROI day one. And they're not doing a good job communicating, so please let's go.
Rick Randolph from Kansas City. One of the things to amplify what you said about the risks of air pollution in the cities that you live in. One study came out from the American Lung Association that showed that for every 16-gallon tank of gas that you burn, you incur $11.85 worth of healthcare costs. So what that means for each individual is there. If you have a inefficient car, say getting 18, 20 miles per gallon, and you drive the standard 12,000 miles a year. Every 2 years, your actions are putting somebody in the emergency room by an economic analysis. So that's an important thing about going to electric cars, EVs, or plug-in hybrids, because our actions do make an immediate difference.
Mel Kerway from Dallas area. Yesterday, bipartisan bill was introduced in Congress to give tax credit basically to nonprofits for renewable energy. Contact your congressperson and senator because it was a bipartisan introduction. We need to get tax credits for churches and other nonprofits that individual citizens can get for their homes. The other thing I want to mention is that we talk very importantly about the grassroots and how local and statewide advocacy is very important. And there is a concerted effort to take out of localities and consolidate within state legislatures in some areas the ability to govern. And so, for instance, in Texas right now, we are, we have a bill on the floor right now to take plastic bags out of the purview of localities and put it statewide. And we've seen things like this where they're consolidating nationwide. Fracking, state, local counties now ban it, because of the state. And then
One more? One more? Yep.
My name is Bill Middlecamp from Arlington, Minnesota, and I want to thank you for your book, Green Faith, which has been very instrumental, very helpful in my church to bring the conversation about caring for God's creation and how our faith calls us to do that. We've gone through one book study with 40 people. We're starting another book study. It's been very helpful. Thank you for that.
Thanks for the shout out. I appreciate it. So I'm going to hand the mic back to Martha Lyle. So many thanks, everybody.
So thanks, Bill. I was gonna do a plug for Fletcher's book. I'll do it one more time. Green Faith, Mobilizing God's People to Protect the Earth, published by Abington Press. So again, if you are interested in doing a study using that book, like Bill just said, he has done one. I think he's generous with his notes, so you might want to see Bill for that. And thank you very much, Fletcher. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.